Thanks, Tarin and Rachel, for including me in this amazing program. And I want to echo what Michael said. STEG is a great initiative, and I especially appreciate that Doug, Joe, and other organizers have incorporated junior faculty and the PhD students in these activities. That matters a lot to us, and I'm already looking forward to keeping involved in the future activities. So in this presentation, I will talk about the agricultural productivity gap that has been briefly mentioned during the previous Rachel's presentation. So the cross-country labor productivity differences are much larger in agriculture than in the non-agricultural sector. So if you look at the US, the labor productivity in the agriculture is $40,000. And then in non-agricultural sector, that is the $48,000. So in the US, relative agricultural labor productivity is the 84%, meaning that agriculture is 16% less productive than the non-agriculture in labor productivity. But if you look at the other countries, say Indonesia and Tanzania, so relative agricultural labor productivity is only 7%. So there has been many papers explaining the reason behind this, including the differences in the input, say capital, labor, or there are other papers talking mostly about the measurement issues. But general consensus is that still we have unexplained the part of the agricultural productivity gap across the countries. So the big question I'm starting with is this. So why are the productivity differences in agriculture so large? So in this paper, I will introduce one potential mechanism generating this agricultural productivity gap across the countries. So that is the relative allocation of the female talent and the male talent across the sectors. And I will tell you that later through the lens of the model. I will show that the misallocation of the female talent can distort the sectoral productivities. So let me show you the one motivating the figures. So this is the share of the female workers in two sectors, again, in the same three countries. So if you look at the US, the only 20% of the agricultural workers are female, while the almost half of the non-agricultural workers are female workers. But if you look at Indonesia or Tanzania, especially in Tanzania, more than half of the agricultural workers are female, and only the 35% of the non-agricultural workers are female. So I will try to interpret the discrepancy in these numbers through the lens of the comparative advantage structure by gender across the two sectors. So there is the consensus in the literature that the women have a comparative disadvantage at agricultural work. This is solely because the men are physically stronger and the strength is valued in agriculture. So then, given this motivation, so what do I do in this paper? Again, in order to discuss about the comparative advantage structure, so I will introduce the general equilibrium model. So this is going to be the general equilibrium Lowy model with the gender-specific frictions different in two sectors. So I'm going to allow the gender-specific the comparative advantage, and then I will also allow the gender-specific the work leisure choices, because another fact I wanna the match is the U-shape the labor force participation by female workers, and inverse the U-shape the labor force participation rate by the male workers. So given this model, so let me briefly talk about the results. So I will show that the agricultural labor productivity is lower when women face the higher barrier in non-agricultural sector due to the selection effect. And then based on that, that will explain the sum of the lower agricultural productivity in low countries. I mean, the lower agricultural productivity and then higher the non-agricultural productivity. Because if you believe that the women face the higher friction or barrier in the non-agricultural sector, so then only very talented the female workers are gonna enter to the non-agricultural sector. So there will be the sectoral, the productivity gap, especially in the countries with the higher barriers against the women. So given this model, I will do the one counterfactual exercise. So I can set the frictions against the women to the current US level. So because I'm introducing the US as the benchmark economy. So then it is going to show that the relative agricultural productivity and GDP per capita increases mostly from the poor countries. So because of the time, I cannot cover all the papers in the literature, and many of you in this room has contributed to the discussion about the gender inequality and the structural transformation of agricultural productivity gaps. Because in the next slide, I will show you the model. I will briefly explain how my general equilibrium model is related to the other papers. So I will show you the general equilibrium model with the selection. So there are two sectors, agricultural sector and non-agricultural sector. And then there is the Roy type of the selection, the occupational choice. So that is similar to the Lagakos and Baus paper. And then in order to match the U-shaped labor force participation by the female workers, I will introduce the separable leisure coming from the Ohanian, Lafo, and the Rogerson's paper. And then I will have the group specific, the gender specific occupational choice coming from the Shea et al. And the Bernstein et al.'s papers. So you can imagine that my model is the combination of these three ingredients. So now let me tell you about the model. The first, preference. So there are two sectors. So I is the individual and CA is the agricultural good consumption and CN is the non-agricultural good consumption. And there is the leisure. So this is the non-homothetic preference. So that is going to match the Engels law. And at the same time, so by introducing the preference for the leisure, which is the P, which is the gender specific, I will match the U-shaped, the female labor force participation. So to make the model tractable, so I modeled the labor force participation as the intensive margin. So everyone is basically participating in the market and they decide how many time they work and they enjoy the leisure. So this is solely for the tractability to exactly identify the size of the friction. So I will talk about that later again. So each worker is endowed with 1 unit of time and the productivity in each industries. So for the male workers, there are the two different productivities, one in agriculture and one in non-agriculture. And the budget constraint is the consumption and the PA is the price of the agricultural good. And that is income is coming from the two sources. So their labor income, so working hour times the maximize the income after the occupational choice, plus the lump sum transfer from the government. So the reason why I have the lump sum transfer is just to close the model, because I will introduce this friction. So tau is the sector and gender specific friction. So I'm gonna assume that the government collects the tax and then distribute it as the lump sum transfer to all the people in the economy. So I will make two assumptions on the friction and the productivities. So again, the friction is the discount factor on the wage. So I'm going to assume that the only women experience the positive frictions in both industries, and these frictions are country specific. So my assumption is that I'm gonna basically ignore the potential margin where there is any the mobility barrier or something like that for the male workers in order to capture the relative, the outcome between the male and the female workers. And the second assumption is that, yeah, it was interesting to see the Michael and then the Thomas's the conversation. Again, I'm doing the occupational choice model, and I will assume the free share distribution. That gives me the closed form solution for many things. So I'm going to assume the bivariate free share distribution. The key parameters are T, location parameter, the theta dispersion parameter, and I'm going to allow the correlation between the two sectors. So in the benchmark model, I will assume that there is no correlation, but if there is any question or if there is any time, I can also show you the result with the positive correlation between the talents across the two sectors. So the production technology is simple. So I'm going to assume the linear technology. So in order to, so my model is mostly the labor supply, the model. So I'm going to basically simplify the labor demand side. So there is the country specific, the productivity, which is the common across the two sectors. But then the labor is coming from the occupational choice decision. So Q is the number of the workers from its gender, and P is the propensity, the group G's propensity to enter the sector S. So here it could be the male workers, the probability of choosing the sector agriculture and so on. And then it's weighted by their working hours and then the talent. So the selection margin is going on right here. So then individual workers make an occupational choice. So men will choose to work in non-agricultural sector if their talent in the non-agricultural sector is sufficiently high enough. This is a wage ratio because this is the 1/PA. So at the end, in the competitive market, the wage ratio is going to be the price in the non-agricultural sector divided by the PA, the price in the agricultural sector. So that's the male workers' occupational choice is quite simple. The female workers' occupational choice, they consider another moment, which is the friction in each sectors. So this is the occupational choice model. They compare the two options. So at the end, what matters is the relative friction. So what matters is how the tau n, the friction in the non-agricultural sector is larger than how much it is larger than the tau in the agricultural sector. So I will define the tau tilde, which is the relative friction in the non-agricultural sector. So if you imagine this higher number on the tau tilde, so then only very talented female workers are gonna enter to the non-agricultural sector. So that's what I do in this proposition. So before going there, the equilibrium concept is quite standard. So household optimized, the market's clear, and then the government achieved the balanced budget just to close the economy. So then my key moment is the tau tilde, which is the relative friction in the non-agricultural sector compared to the agricultural sector. And my assumption is that only the female workers are experiencing this friction. So then when this friction increases, so the propensity, the women's propensity of entering to the agricultural sector is gonna increase. So then due to the selection effect, the average quality in the agricultural sector is gonna decline. So naturally and eventually, the labor productivity in the agricultural sector is gonna decline. So then the question is, how do we measure this relative friction from many countries? And the question is whether the poor countries actually have the higher relative friction in the non-agriculture against the female workers. So in the project, I'm somewhat agnostic to the actual source of this friction, but in the model, this could be interpreted as the employer's explicit discrimination, like the Becker's paper. Or at the end, I will also show that this relative friction is correlated with the perception on the women, the surveyed from the World Value Survey. So I will discuss about the potential sources of the friction at the very end. but in terms of the model and in terms of the counterfactor, so I'm somewhat agnostic to the actual source of the frictions. So then the question is, how do we measure the friction? So that is coming from the free share distribution magic. So this is only true under the assumption of the free share distribution. So the gender wage gaps in agriculture and non-agricultural sectors are given by these two equations. So the gender wage gaps are the function of the friction, the gap in the propensity, and the gap in the productivity. Okay, so suppose that we know all the distributional parameters, say the location parameter in the free share, the distribution parameter, dispersion parameter, correlation, and then suppose that we know the price gap and the quantity gaps. The quantity gap inferred from the occupational choice. So then we can back out the tau, the friction from all the countries. So that's where I'm going. And another very powerful prediction is that in the model, the two wage gaps should be the same. So the one data challenge is that so especially from the low income countries, it is challenging to get the wage gap by sectors. But relying on the prediction from the model, I can just use the wage gap, the economy-wide the wage gap. And I also tested whether this is true for the countries where I have the micro level data on the earnings and wages. So you see the 45-degree line, and the y-axis is the non-agricultural gender earning gap, and x-axis is the agricultural gender earning gap. And here there are only 3 countries where I can get the hourly wage from the IPOMs. So you see that many of the dots are lying over the 45-degree line. So I mean, this is not perfect, but this is the close enough, and this is actually very powerful prediction so that I can use the many countries in the calibration. So let me first do the calibration for the US economy, introducing the US as the benchmark economy, assuming that the productivity is 100, and then there is no friction against the female workers. Again, this is only the normalization because I'm gonna do the counterfactor at the end, the setting the level of the friction to the US level. There are the 6 distribution parameters and the 4 preference parameters. So I'm not going to spend much time on this, but the one thing I can tell you is that the dispersion parameter is calibrated to match the wage dispersion. And in the benchmark case, I will assume the 0 correlation in the talent. And the location parameter, the only message here is that just looking at the US data, what we can tell is that the female workers have a comparative advantage in the non-agricultural sector, and the male workers have the comparative advantage in the agricultural sector. And then all the preference parameters are calibrated to match the specific moment, and especially the pies to match the inverse, the U-shape and the U-shape, the labor force participation rate by the male and the female workers. Oh, not yet. Oh, sorry. So this is only for the US economy. Later, I will estimate the country-specific parameter to estimate that U-shape the labor force participation. So then I calibrate the 5 other, the country-specific parameters: productivity, the preference on the leisure, and the frictions. I use the 66 countries. The requirement is that I need to have information on the labor force participation. The propensity is coming from the occupational choice, real GDP per capita, and the gender wage gap, economy-wide the gender wage gap. So I can use the 66 countries out of almost 200 countries in the world. Fortunately, I basically cover both the low and the high income countries. This is GDP per capita, and then histogram in blue are the 66 countries in my sample. And I also cover somewhat equal countries and unequal countries in my sample. So from now on, I will work with these 66 countries where I have all the moments I need to calibrate the 5 country-specific parameters. So then again, the friction is the function of the gender wage gap, the propensity gap, and then we know the free share parameters from the US economy. So I'm gonna tell that, so if I have the less female workers in the non-agricultural sector compared to the comparative advantage structure inferred from the US economy, so then I will tell that it is likely that the female workers are facing the higher barrier in those countries. So that will be the logic. So then the question is whether it is reasonable to assume that the location parameter and the dispersion parameters are the same parameter could be applied to the other countries that has been inferred from the US economy. So I'll be happy to answer to that question if there is a question during the Q&A, but the short answer I can give you is that, so it could be biased in either direction, but I believe in low-income countries, because they don't have a tractor. So from the previous, the Tarin's presentation, they are using hoes and they are basically using the different types of the capital in the agricultural production. So it is more likely that the male workers have the more comparative advantage in the agricultural sector in low-income countries under this one specific the margins. So then my friction might be underestimating the friction the female workers are facing, but I'm basically open to all other the potential differences and the potential margins affecting the occupational choice differently across the countries. But my short answer is that in certain the scenario, the estimate for the friction could be the lower bound. So then those are the estimated taus. So I'm gonna basically focus on the panel on the right. So this is the relative friction, the normalizing the US to 1. So in the low income countries, you see that the female workers are facing the higher friction in the non-agricultural sector relative to the agricultural sector. So only very talented female workers are gonna enter to the non-agricultural sector, generating the agricultural productivity gap. And one exception is Turkey. So I will show you the correlation of my measure with some perception I can observe from the World Value Survey. You will also see that Turkey is kind of the outlier in the most of the figures. So from the simulation, this is the simulated the sectoral labor productivity. Again, the relative agricultural labor productivity. So I had no time to show the data itself, but the fitted line is coming from the data on the sectoral labor productivity. And then each dots are the model simulation results. So the general declining trend is coming from the Roy type selection. So that is consistent to the Lagakos and the Baus paper. So over the process of the structural transformation, the size of the agricultural sector, the shrinks. So only very talented workers are gonna work in the agricultural sector. So that's what you see, the increase in the relative agricultural productivity, but the deviations are basically my own channel. So say Turkey, you see that the simulated the relative agricultural labor productivity is much lower than other countries with the similar the level of the GDP. So the next one is the counterfactual exercise showing the power of the basically the my channel, the contribution of the my paper. So the setting frictions to the current US level. So I should tell you that this is not universally good news for the many countries, because there are the many countries, more than 10 to 20 countries having the lower gender wage gap than the current gender wage gap in the US. But if you look at all the low-income countries in general, they have a higher the gender wage gap, and then so they have the higher the gap in the propensity. So by setting the frictions to the US level, the left-hand side is the relative agricultural productivity. So that increases mostly from the low-income countries. And then I can also calculate and then show you the real GDP per capita. But I should tell you that in the model, there is also the income effect. Because so once you remove the friction, that means that the transfers are not going to the male workers. So that reduces the income of the the male workers. So this is the welfare improving for the low income countries, but the measured in the real GDP per capita, just looking at the quantity produced, some countries might be losing because there is the income effect and some workers are choosing to take the more leisure after this shock. But my point is that
I should just interrupt and say you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So one of the last few things I want to show you is the discussion about the potential sources of the friction. So I'm showing you the several perceptions measured from the World Value Survey on the relative friction I calculated from the data through the lens of the model by using the gender wage gap and the propensity gap. So it is somewhat correlated with this subjective perception. So on the positive perception on being wife, negative perception on the female business executives, negative perception on the women's university education, negative perception about the women earning more money. So especially, so the correlation is significant from the B and C. So any employer specific discrimination or any discrimination against the female workers going to the higher position or more prestigious the occupations. So that could be related, associated with the friction I'm measuring here. And another potential source is the human capital accumulation. This is also strongly associated with the measure calculated from the price and the quantities. And other two measures are the negative perception about the female political leader, and then the negative perception about the working mother. Again, still positively correlated. So there are several discussions I have in the paper. Because of time, I still have, say, 1 to 2 minutes. I will quickly show you the time series analysis. So I can apply the same model to understand the time series development of the single country. So I will show you the US. So what happened in the US for the past 60 years or the 50 years? So the left-hand side is the relative friction in the non-agriculture estimated from the census data in 1960 toward the 2010. I mean, 2010 is the year I used in the previous exercise. So the female workers were facing the higher relative friction in the non-agriculture in 1960, and it has declined over time. And after doing this counterfactual the exercise, setting the friction to the US 2010 level, you see the increase in the real GDP per capita. So one interpretation is that in 1960, the real GDP per capita could have been the 4% higher than what we observed if there were no the gender specific friction across the sectors. Let me conclude. So I basically showed the potential channel to explain the agricultural productivity gap, which is the misallocation of the female talent, distorting the sectoral productivity. So my message here is that the poor countries could improve the overall labor productivity, especially the agricultural labor productivity, by removing the barrier against the women in the non-agricultural sector. Again, I'm somewhat agnostic to the actual source of the friction, but I told you that these are the correlated with the perception on the female, the big business executive, the human capital accumulation, and so on.
Okay, thanks, Munseob. That was great. There was a bunch of action in the chat. So let me start out and let Rachel ask her questions. You had a couple questions.
Okay, thank you, Munseob. It's very interesting work, and especially all those data on 66 countries. I have two questions. One is on the interpretation of all the non-working hour at leisure, where you capture in that gender-specific leisure preference parameter 5G. But as I showed in the very beginning, the overview slide, home production is a big chunk for many countries, including, for those 66 countries. I'm sure you can go back to that ILO publication on the time use, and you will see that 66 countries all have very high amounts of home production, especially for women. So if you are going to, take that 5G and really think about the home production, then the 5G will evolve endogenously. And also it will interact with your non-agriculture sector. As we mentioned earlier, there's this close margin of home production and the non-agriculture sector in the market. So that will be some interaction there. So I don't know your thought about that. The second one, I think Kevin will mention a bit more, is just that because I'm absorbed now at this stage about family farm and home production. So the second point is about family farm. So the interpretation here you take is that women get stuck in agriculture because there's some barrier for women to go into non-agriculture. But an alternative, it could be that there's some barrier for the family farm to be modernized. Therefore, women were trapped in agriculture just to produce the amount of agriculture. And that obviously will have very different interpretation, whether it should be the development of the agriculture sector in the market overall, or is it the barrier about non-agriculture? But Kevin will follow on that, so I stop here.
So then, can I collect the Kevin's question and then I will answer to all the questions at the same time, because if that's the related.
Sure, Kevin, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, Munseob, very cool. Yeah, so sort of following up on Rachel's point, you sort of answered this towards the end, but I was trying to think of this in light of the evidence on what we know about people who switch sectors, what their wage gains look like and what they don't look like, and by gender, in fact. And because the interpretation of that the interpretation of your distortion seems to matter quite a bit for how we would think about what your model would predict as it relates to those empirics. So I was just wondering if you could say a couple things about that.
Okay, great. Rachel and Kevin, thank you for the great questions. So let me first answer to the Rachel's question about the pi G. So I'm not so sure what you meant by the endogenous, but I'm calibrating the pi G, the country specific. I'm not matching the home production. Definitely, I should check the ILO data and the other data you are studying to get the idea about.
I refer to 5G in your utility.
Yeah.
The 5G,
yes, 5G.
specific leisure, yeah.
Yes, yes. So I'm calibrating that number, the country specific. So there is the U-shape, the labor force participation rate. So I'm basically estimating that in those countries, I mean, solely coming from the preference, they have they have the more preference on the leisure, and these countries have the lower the preference on the leisures. But I definitely want to revisit the pi G, taking into account the home production, and I should think harder about how my model is going to change once I include the home production in the production of, say, the non-agriculture, the sector. So that part I should think harder to tell you whether my main identification strategy would still hold or not. I mean, I think that's a great the comment. And the second point is about the family farm. Sure. So that's also the reason why I'm not focusing much on the aggregate welfare in my counterfactual exercise, because in the low-income countries, the part of the reason why we see the female workers in the agriculture is because they want to be the next to their children and so on. So this could be driven by the preference. But if you look at the sectoral productivity gap, that is still the distortion, because if there is the preference, this could be interpreted as a subsidy in the agricultural sector. So then that will still distort the talent across the sectors. So, but that has very important policy implications, because if the part of that is driven by the preference, I believe so. I mean, I just don't know the relative importance between the preference and the gender specific, the barrier. So then we may end up with a different policy, the recommendations. So, but that's also the reason why I don't talk too much about the aggregate welfare consequences. And then answering to the Kevin's the question, that's a great question. That's definitely I should do. So you see that I'm only using the cross-sectional data coming from the IPUMS. So I'm not using the panel data from the, especially the low-income countries. So yeah, I will definitely do more work documenting and understanding the change in the wage from the switchers. So I believe the Doug, David, and the Michael, they had in their paper, they had some information about the wage change, especially for those switchers. I will definitely go back to that paper and see what they found, and then think harder how I can relate that to my findings.
Sorry, can I just follow up very quickly?
Sure.
Yeah, quickly.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So I would just say you have there's a nice test here, right? Because like the things that Rachel were mentioning are things that are not going to distort the marginal worker, but are still going to change the way selection happens. And then there are other things that are going to, in fact, distort the marginal switcher. And so I think your model can rationalize either one.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there are a couple more hands up. So Marcus Proschke, would you like to go ahead with your question?
Yes, hello. So thanks for taking my question. Munseob, this is a very nice work, and I like the main intuition is really intuitive. I guess we have sort of a similar logic a bit as in Lagakos and War, right? You have more people in the agricultural sector, and that basically pushes down average productivity in that sector because of the selection effects. So I wanted to comment on something here, which is that I think you assume in your computation that there's no correlation of the abilities that individuals have in the two sectors, right? And I wanted to add the comment that this is not innocuous at all, right? One could think, for example, about a setting where people have a strong positive correlation between these abilities, right? So if you're a good farmer, you tend to be also a good non-farmer, right? And a lot of dispersion in the non-farming abilities. I think that's like intuitively, that's a fairly plausible parametric assumption. And I have a paper where we kind of suggest that that this is a plausible case in Africa. Now, in that case, your results would be quite different, right? Because if you, in that case, you distort women into agriculture, well, those are going to be the women who have sort of the weakest comparative advantage in agriculture, right? But in this setting with a strong positive correlation in abilities, these women would actually be the best farmers, right? So the reason that in a world without the distortion, these women are not farming is that they would be the best farmers, like in that set, but they're even better at the other activity, right? Now you distort them out of the other activity, they go into farming, but they're actually better farmers than the women who are already in farming, right? So, so it's not completely obvious that this distortion that leads to more women in farming is going to reduce agricultural productivity. Right? And by the way, that's a comment that kind of applies to Lagakos and War generally too. It really matters what the correlation structure of the abilities is, right? So your assumption there matters. And maybe that's where my comment actually connects to Kevin's comment or question, right? Because of that, it's kind of important to connect the literature that uses evidence on switchers, or in our paper, we use a bit something different to try and figure that out.
Okay, great, Marcus. Thank you for the great comments. And I mean, this is mostly the comments, but I can tell you quickly that, so the slide I'm basically showing you is the robustness check of the result using the correlated structure in the free share distribution. So I use the linear correlation, which is the 0.44, consistent to the Lagakos and the Baus paper. So then actually the gains from the removing the misallocation of the female talent are quantitatively higher when the sectoral talents are the positively correlated. And this is also consistent to the very frontier paper in the trade by the Natalia Raimondo and the Lind. So they also found that when there is the positive correlation, they found that when there is a positive correlation across the technologies across the countries, so then the gains from the trade is larger than the case with the independent distribution. So I should think harder about your story, because I think you had a story going to the opposite direction. So I'm very happy that this is also the recorded. So I was taking the note, but I will come back to the story and think harder about how I can answer to the hypothesis you had. And then the second point about the switcher, yes, that's definitely on my to-do list.
Yes, I'm glad you looked at this already. So I think we should maybe talk more offline about what's going on here, because from a theoretical point of view, it's actually somewhat puzzling.
Yeah, so I'd be so happy to do that. Yeah.
Okay, and then we have another question from Richard Rogerson.
Thanks. I enjoyed the paper a lot. I think it's very interesting, but I don't know if you spoke to this and I missed it, but this relates a little bit to Rachel's comment about the role of family farms. And that is, I think, one of the deeper questions in the context of this is there something different about current less developed countries relative to current advanced countries when they were at a similar stage? And if it's all about family farms, then it says this is just, you know, natural and everybody went through this. But I think, I mean, I guess my belief and sense from the literature is the agricultural gaps are much more severe in the current less developed countries than they were historically for rich countries. And so then you want to think what's special about these countries. And then it's important to disentangle if it's just family farms or is it something else. And so I don't know if you spoke to that and I missed it, but I'm curious just to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, Richard. Yeah, those are the great comments, especially about the family farm. In the model, the way of incorporating is only through this pi g, the governing the labor force participation. So this is somewhat different from the family farms. And I'm totally with you that the current low-income countries, so the more female workers are working in the family farm compared to the historical evidence, say, from the US. So my model is not explaining all the agricultural productivity gaps. And then I think my model will be more powerful and convincing in the time series comparison, because as you just said, the share of the female workers in the family farm, just looking at the US, the 1960, compared to the current countries having the level of the GDP per capita. So the potential bias coming from there will be smaller in this time series comparison. But yeah, I'm totally with you. And
I'm sorry to interrupt. I would just say, I mean, I don't think looking at US 1960 is that powerful in terms of speaking to this. The US 1960 is, you know, very far advanced compared to the countries you're talking to. So I don't think
totally
that's kind of that powerful.
Yeah. I see that. Yes. So alternative option is looking at the currently middle-income countries and looking at their historical development. So in the paper, I also looked at the Turkey from the 1960 to the 2000. So then the GDP per capita of the Turkey starting from the 1960 to the 2000 is slightly closer to the low income versus the middle income, the country comparison in my cross-sectional analysis. But yeah, I'm totally with you, and that's the limitation of my paper.
Okay, any other last questions from the participants for Munseob?
Can I ask a question about the counterfactual, Munseob? So yeah,
hi, Federico.
Hi, Munseob. I was curious about the role of income effects for your counterfactual on sectoral productivity. So there seems to be some interaction here between that and the frictions, meaning that, you know, I remove the frictions, that improves the allocation of talent, that generates higher productivity, higher income, which generates a smaller agricultural sector, which also improves productivity. So is that a big channel? Or what happens if you shut down the income effects in your counterfactual?
So it is more than that. So the income impact is, as Federico, you said, that's true. So there is a little bit of the structural transformation going on, because the more female workers are marginally reallocating to the non-agricultural sector. but the powerful, but something I wanna ignore, the income effect here is the allocation of the tax, reallocation of the tax by the government. So before the counterfactual, there is the government giving the lump sum tax to the older workers. And then after the counterfactual, so the older workers are not getting the transfer anymore. So income effect could go to either direction. So it is increasing the income for the certain fraction of the workers, and it is also decreasing the income for the certain fraction of the workers. So that's why the real GDP is not universally increasing for all the countries, especially from the low income countries. So then how do I disentangle each channels? I mean, that's definitely on my to-do list. So I'm gonna generate the same figure, removing the income effect. So that is on my to-do list.